The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he knew would be the last time. After 25 years of faithful service to the crown, today marked his final day as a member of the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons, each one polished to perfection, despite the weight of emotion pressing down on his chest. James had joined the Guard as a young man of 19, fresh from military training, and filled with pride at the honor of protecting the royal family. Over the decades, he had witnessed countless ceremonies, state visits, and historic moments. He had stood motionless through torrential rain, blazing summer heat, and bitter winter winds. Through it all, he had maintained the stoic composure that defined his role, never breaking character, never showing emotion. The palace corridors buzzed with their usual morning activity as staff prepared for another day of royal duties. James walked slowly through the familiar hallways, his polished boots echoing against the marble floors. Each step felt heavier than the last, knowing that soon he would trade these grand surroundings for the quiet of civilian life. His pension awaited him, along with a small cottage in the countryside where he planned to tend a garden and finally rest. As he made his way toward the guardhouse, James reflected on the countless faces he had seen pass by during his years of service. Tourists from every corner of the world had photographed him, tested his resolve with silly faces and loud noises, and marveled at his unwavering discipline. Dignitaries had walked past him during state functions, and members of the royal family had acknowledged his presence with subtle nods of appreciation. But among all those memories, one face had become particularly dear to him over the past few years. Prince George, now 10 years old, had grown from a curious toddler into an intelligent and observant young boy. During family visits to the palace, George had often paused near James's post, studying the guard with genuine interest rather than the casual glance most people offered. James remembered the first time he had noticed the young prince watching him. George couldn't have been more than 6 years old then, clutching his nanny's hand as they walked through the courtyard. The boy had stopped suddenly, tugging at his nanny's sleeve and pointing at James with wide, fascinated eyes. From that day forward, whenever George visited the palace, he would find excuses to walk past James's post. The relationship had developed in the way that only a friendship between a child and an adult bound by protocol could develop. James couldn't speak or move while on duty, but George seemed to understand this instinctively. The boy would position himself where James could see him, and then proceed to entertain the stoic guard with elaborate shadow puppets, funny faces, or dramatic reenactments of stories from his favorite books. Sometimes George would bring small drawings he had made, holding them up proudly for James to see. The guard's eyes would crinkle almost imperceptibly at the corners, the only sign of his appreciation that protocol allowed. Other times, the young prince would simply stand quietly beside James for a few minutes, as if understanding that sometimes companionship required nothing more than shared presence. Over the years, James had watched George grow more confident and articulate. The boy's visits became less frequent as his schedule filled with tutoring, royal engagements, and the responsibilities that came with his position in the line of succession. But whenever George did appear at the palace, he made a point of seeking out his silent friend. James had never spoken to the prince directly, of course. The rules of his position were clear and absolute. But in those moments when their eyes met, a communication deeper than words had developed between them. James saw in George a kindness and genuine curiosity that gave him hope for the future of the monarchy. The boy possessed a natural empathy that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. Now, as James prepared for his final shift, he wondered if Prince George knew about his impending retirement. The palace staff had been informed, and news traveled quickly through the royal household. Part of him hoped the boy would make one last appearance, while another part dreaded the difficulty of saying goodbye without words. The guardhouse was already busy with activity as James arrived for the morning briefing. His fellow guards, many of whom had served alongside him for years, offered respectful nods and firm handshakes. They understood the significance of this day, though few would express their emotions openly. The military culture that bound them together celebrated duty above sentiment. But James could see the respect and affection in their eyes. Captain Reynolds, the officer in charge, pulled James aside for a private moment. The two men had worked together for over a decade, developing the kind of professional relationship built on mutual trust and shared dedication to their duty. Reynolds had been dreading this day, knowing that James's departure would leave a void that would be difficult to fill. As James took his position for the final time, he allowed himself a moment to absorb every detail of his surroundings: the weight of his bearskin hat, the feel of his rifle in his gloved hands, the sound of tourists beginning to gather outside the palace gates. These sensations had become as familiar as breathing, and soon they would exist only in memory. The morning passed quietly, with the usual stream of visitors and palace business flowing around him. James maintained his professional demeanor, but internally he was saying goodbye to a life that had defined him for more than 2 decades. As the hours ticked by, he began to accept that perhaps this farewell would be a private affair, marked only by the respect of his colleagues and the satisfaction of duty faithfully performed. The afternoon brought an unexpected bustle of activity to the palace grounds. Word had quietly spread through the royal household that Sergeant Mitchell would be completing his final duty tour, and several staff members found reasons to walk past his post throughout the day. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked alongside palace security for 15 years, paused to adjust some flowers in a nearby planter, offering James a warm smile and a subtle thumbs up when she thought no one was looking. Even some of the newer guards, men who had looked up to James as a mentor during their early days of service, managed to catch his eye and offer respectful nods as they passed. James felt a warmth spreading through his chest despite the cool afternoon air. He had never realized how many people had been quietly observing his dedication over the years, or how much his steadfast presence had meant to the daily rhythm of palace life. As the clock tower chimed 3 o'clock, James noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the private royal apartments. Prince George, dressed in a navy blazer and gray trousers, was walking purposefully across the courtyard with his tutor, Mr. Davidson, a few steps behind. The young prince carried a small wrapped package under his arm, and his usually cheerful expression seemed more serious than usual. James felt his heart skip slightly as he realized that George was heading directly toward his post. The boy had somehow learned about his retirement and had come to say goodbye. As they drew closer, James could see that George's eyes were slightly red around the edges, as if he had been struggling with strong emotions. The sight of the young prince fighting back tears while trying to maintain his royal composure touched James more deeply than any formal ceremony could have. George stopped about 3 feet in front of James, the package now clutched tightly in both hands. For a moment, the boy seemed to be gathering his courage, glancing back at Mr. Davidson, who offered an encouraging nod. The tutor had clearly been briefed on the situation and understood the significance of this farewell for both the prince and the departing guard. "Sergeant Mitchell," George began, his voice slightly higher than usual but admirably steady, "I heard today is your last day protecting our family." The formality of his words couldn't quite hide the genuine emotion behind them, and James felt his own composure beginning to waver for the first time in his long career. The boy continued, "I wanted to give you something to remember all of us by, but especially to remember that what you did mattered. You protected us, but you also became my friend, even though we never got to talk properly before today." George extended the wrapped package toward James, who found himself in an unprecedented situation. Protocol dictated that he should remain motionless and silent, but this was clearly an extraordinary moment that called for a human response rather than a military one. After a brief internal struggle, James carefully accepted the package with his free hand, his eyes never leaving George's face. "My father told me that when someone serves our family with honor for so many years, they become part of our family too," George said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He said that true loyalty creates bonds that last forever, and that even when someone's official duty ends, the respect and affection we feel for them never does." James felt moisture forming in the corners of his eyes, a sensation he hadn't experienced while in uniform for over 2 decades. The young prince's words carried the wisdom of someone far older, yet retained the sincerity that only a child could express so purely. It was clear that George had thought carefully about what he wanted to say, possibly with guidance from his parents, but the emotions were entirely his own. Mr. Davidson stepped forward slightly, ready to guide the prince away if the moment became too overwhelming, but George held his ground. He had more to say, and despite his young age, he understood the importance of expressing it properly. The courtyard had grown unusually quiet, as if the very walls of the palace were listening to this unprecedented exchange. "I know you couldn't talk to me during all those times I visited," George continued, "but I always felt like you were listening when I told you about my day or showed you my drawings. My mother says that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. And I think we had lots of those conversations, didn't we?" James nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture so slight that only George would have noticed it. But the boy's face lit up with the brightest smile James had seen from him, as if that tiny acknowledgement had confirmed everything he had hoped to be true about their silent friendship over the years. "I want you to know that when I'm older and have to do important royal duties, I'll remember how you stood here every day, no matter what the weather was like, just to keep us safe. I'll remember that being responsible means doing your job even when it's hard or boring, or when nobody is watching. You taught me that without ever saying a word." The wisdom in George's words struck James like a thunderbolt. All those hours of standing motionless, all those days of maintaining discipline in the face of distractions and discomfort, had been observed and understood by this remarkable young boy. George had been learning lessons about duty, commitment, and service simply by watching James perform his role with quiet dignity day after day. Other members of the palace staff had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual sight of a lengthy conversation taking place at a guard post. Cook assistants peered around doorways, gardeners paused in their work, and even some of the other guards found reasons to position themselves where they could observe this historic moment. Everyone understood they were witnessing something special, a bridge between the formal protocols of royal life and the genuine human connections that sometimes transcended them. George looked down at his feet for a moment, gathering courage for his final words. When he looked up again, his young face held an expression of mature determination that reminded James powerfully of the boy's father and grandfather. "I hope someday I can serve our country with the same honor you've shown, and I hope that wherever you go next you'll be happy and know that you made a difference." The silence that followed was profound and sacred. James stood a little straighter, his chest swelling with pride and gratitude for this unexpected recognition from someone whose opinion mattered more than any medal or commendation ever could. In that moment, all the years of sacrifice, all the missed family holidays and personal milestones that his service had required, felt worthwhile and meaningful. As George stepped back, James carefully unwrapped the package with one hand while maintaining his grip on his rifle with the other. Inside the brown paper was a beautiful wooden box, clearly handcrafted with intricate care. The lid bore a small brass nameplate engraved with Sergeant James Mitchell, a true guardian, in elegant script. James's breath caught in his throat as he realized this wasn't simply a gift picked up from a shop, but something that had been specially commissioned with thought and planning. George watched anxiously as James examined the box, clearly hoping for a positive reaction. "My grandfather helped me choose the wood," the boy explained quietly. "He said oak was the strongest and would last forever, just like the friendship between a guard and the family he protects. There's something inside too, but you should wait until later to look at it properly." James lifted the lid just enough to glimpse the contents and felt his heart swell with emotion. Inside was a collection of photographs spanning his entire career at the palace. There he was as a young recruit, standing proudly in formation during his first ceremonial duty. Another photo showed him during a state visit, maintaining perfect posture as foreign dignitaries passed by. But what moved him most were the candid shots that someone had clearly taken over the years without his knowledge. One photograph captured a moment from several years ago when George, then about 7 years old, had been showing James one of his drawings. The image perfectly captured the quiet intensity of their connection, with George holding up his artwork and James's eyes clearly focused on the boy with gentle attention, despite his formal stance. Another photo showed James standing guard during a winter storm, snow gathering on his bearskin hat while tourists hurried past seeking shelter. "My father's photographer took some of these," George explained, "and some came from the palace archives. We wanted you to have pictures that showed how important your job was, not just to us, but to everyone who felt safer because you were here." The thoughtfulness behind this gift overwhelmed James in a way that surprised him. Throughout his career, he had received formal recognition and commendations, but nothing had ever felt as personal and meaningful as this gesture. From a 10-year-old boy who had understood the true value of his service better than most adults, Mr. Davidson checked his pocket watch and gently cleared his throat. indicating that the prince's schedule would soon require their departure. But George seemed reluctant to end this moment, perhaps sensing that once he walked away, this chapter of his childhood would be permanently closed. The guard who had been a constant, reassuring presence during his visits to the palace would be gone, replaced by someone new who wouldn't share their special history. "Sergeant Mitchell," George said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Will you remember me when you're living in your new house? My mother says that when people retire, sometimes they want to forget about their old job and just think about new adventures." James felt a surge of emotion so powerful that he had to consciously steady himself. The idea that this remarkable young boy might worry about being forgotten touched him deeply. Without thinking about protocol or proper procedure, James shifted his rifle to his left hand and placed his right hand gently on George's shoulder. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it conveyed everything he couldn't say in words. "I could never forget you, Your Royal Highness," James said quietly, speaking to a member of the royal family for the first time in his 25-year career. His voice was rougher than usual, thick with emotion. "You've brought joy to every single one of my days here. Watching you grow up has been one of the greatest privileges of my life." George's eyes brightened with relief and happiness, and he stood a little taller, as if James's words had given him confidence about his own worth and place in the world. The boy had clearly been uncertain about whether his childhood visits and silent interactions had meant anything to the stoic guard, and James's acknowledgement had validated something important for him. Several members of the palace staff who had been discreetly observing from a distance found themselves wiping their eyes. Mrs. Henderson had to turn away for a moment to compose herself, while the younger guards exchanged glances of deep respect for their departing colleague. Even Mr. Davidson, who had witnessed countless royal interactions during his years as a tutor, seemed moved by the genuine emotion of the exchange. "Your Royal Highness," James continued, "someday when you have your own children, I hope you'll tell them about the importance of duty and service. Not because someone is watching or because it's required, but because it's the right thing to do. You already understand that lesson better than most adults I've known." George nodded solemnly, clearly taking these words to heart as advice that would guide him throughout his future role as a member of the royal family. At 10 years old, he was already beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that would one day rest on his shoulders. And James's example had shown him that true service came from the heart, rather than from obligation alone. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the courtyard and signaling that James's final shift was drawing to a close. Other guards were already beginning to position themselves for the evening rotation, and the familiar rhythm of changing duties continued around them. But in this small circle of connection between a departing guard and a young prince, time seemed suspended. "I have one more thing to tell you," George said, glancing at Mr. Davidson as if seeking permission to share something important. The tutor nodded encouragingly, clearly aware of whatever the prince was about to reveal. "My father is planning to give you a special honor at the ceremony next week, but I wanted you to know early that our whole family talked about how much you've meant to us." James felt his knees weaken slightly at this news. The idea that the royal family had discussed his service in their private conversations, that his dedication had been noticed and valued at the highest levels, was almost too much to process. He had always assumed that his role was simply part of the background of royal life, important, but largely invisible to those he protected. "We know that you missed birthdays and holidays to be here," George continued with the matter-of-fact tone that children often use to state profound truths. "We know that you stood in the rain and snow and heat because you cared about keeping us safe. That's not something you forget about someone, even if they never say a single word to you." As their conversation continued, word of the extraordinary scene had reached other members of the royal household. From an upstairs window, Princess Catherine appeared briefly, offering a warm wave that both James and George noticed. The sight of the princess acknowledging this moment added another layer of significance to an already unprecedented afternoon. Even she understood the importance of this farewell and wanted to show her respect for the guard who had served her family so faithfully. George noticed his mother's gesture and beamed with pride, as if her approval had confirmed that his decision to seek out James for this goodbye had been exactly right. "Mummy said that sometimes the most important friendships are the ones that grow quietly over time," he explained to James. "She said you, and I proved that people can care about each other even when they Can't use regular words to show it. The wisdom in these observations, clearly influenced by conversations with his parents but expressed in his own sincere way, demonstrated the remarkable emotional intelligence that George was developing. His ability to understand and articulate the unique nature of his relationship with James showed maturity far beyond his years, shaped by a family that clearly valued authentic human connections alongside formal protocols. Mr. Davidson stepped forward again, this time with genuine regret in his expression. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid we really must continue with your afternoon schedule. The ambassador from New Zealand is expecting you for tea in 20 minutes, and your mother specifically requested that you not be late." George nodded understanding, but turned back to James with obvious reluctance. "Before I go, I want to ask you something important," he said, his young face serious with concentration. "When you have your garden and you're taking care of your flowers and vegetables, will you think about us sometimes? Not in a sad way, but in a happy way that makes you smile?" James felt his throat tighten with emotion. The image the boy had painted, of quiet retirement days filled with simple pleasures while holding warm memories of his years of service, was exactly what he hoped his future would hold. "Every single day, Your Royal Highness," he replied honestly. "Every morning when I step outside, I'll remember standing here with you and feeling proud to be part of something bigger than myself." George's face lit up with genuine joy at this response. "And when I have to do boring state dinners or long ceremonies, I'll think about how you stood here for hours and hours without complaining. And it will help me remember that being brave doesn't mean you're not tired or uncomfortable. It just means you do what needs to be done anyway." The profound understanding in George's words revealed how much he had learned simply by observing James over the years. The boy had absorbed lessons about duty, perseverance, and quiet courage without any formal instruction, demonstrating the power of example in shaping young minds. James realized that his silent presence had been teaching all along, even when he hadn't known he had a student. "Your Royal Highness," James said carefully, "may I give you one piece of advice to carry with you?" George nodded eagerly, clearly treasuring the opportunity to receive direct guidance from someone he admired. "Remember that true leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having all the answers. It's about being steady and reliable when others need you most, just like you've been for me today." George considered these words thoughtfully, his intelligent eyes showing that he understood the deeper meaning behind them. "You mean like how you were always here when we needed to feel safe, even when nothing scary was actually happening?" "Exactly," James confirmed. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present and dependable. People remember who they could count on, especially during ordinary days when nothing special was happening. Those are the moments that really matter." This exchange had drawn the attention of several tourists who had been observing the unusual length and apparent intensity of the conversation between the guard and the young boy. While they couldn't hear the words being spoken, the obvious emotion and respect flowing between the two figures created a captivating scene that many were discreetly photographing from beyond the palace gates. One elderly woman from Germany, who had been visiting London with her granddaughter, whispered to her companion in heavily accented English, "Look how that child speaks to the guard with such respect. This is something very special happening." Her granddaughter, perhaps 8 years old herself, watched George with wide eyes, clearly impressed by seeing someone near her own age conducting himself with such dignity and purpose. Inside the palace, kitchen staff had begun gathering near windows that offered views of the courtyard, drawn by word that something remarkable was taking place at Sergeant Mitchell's post. Chef Morrison, who had often seen James walking through the service corridors during shift changes, found himself genuinely moved by the sight of the young prince taking time to honor the departing guard's service. "That's how you know you're looking at real quality," he murmured to his assistant. "When a child that young understands the importance of gratitude and takes action to show it properly. That boy's going to make a fine king someday, mark my words." The photographer assigned to document palace events had also been quietly notified about the significance of the moment. From a respectful distance, he captured images that would later become treasured documentation of this historic farewell. Unlike the formal posed photographs that typically filled palace albums, these pictures would show genuine emotion and spontaneous connection between two people whose friendship had transcended their vastly different positions in life. George glanced once more at Mr. Davidson's patient but meaningful expression and knew that his time was nearly up. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to promise me something," he said with the earnest intensity that only children can bring to their requests. "Promise me that if you're ever in London and you see the palace, you'll remember that you'll always be welcome here. Not as a visitor, but as family." James felt his composure wavering again at these words. The idea that this young prince considered him family, that his years of service had earned him a permanent place in the affections of the people he had protected, was almost overwhelming. "I promise, Your Royal Highness," he managed to say, "and I promise that whenever I see news about your family in the papers or on television, I'll feel proud knowing that I had a small part in keeping you safe while you grew into the remarkable young man you're becoming." The moment had arrived when George would have to leave, but the young prince seemed to be gathering courage for one final gesture. He stepped closer to James and, with the natural impulsiveness of childhood, combined with royal confidence, reached out to take the guard's free hand in both of his own small ones. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but the warmth and sincerity of the gesture spoke volumes about the genuine affection that had developed between them over the years. "Thank you for being my friend," George whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with such heartfelt emotion that James felt tears threatening to spill over despite his military training. "Thank you for showing me what it looks like to serve others with honor every single day." James squeezed the boy's hands gently before releasing them, a final acknowledgement of their special bond. "Thank you for reminding me why this job was always worth doing," he replied softly. "Knowing you were watching helped me be the best guard I could be." Mr. Davidson approached respectfully, clearly reluctant to interrupt but duty-bound to keep the prince on schedule. "Your Royal Highness, we really must go now," he said gently. "But perhaps Sergeant Mitchell would be willing to walk with us partway to the reception room. I believe we could arrange that without disrupting protocol." James looked toward Captain Reynolds, who had been observing the entire exchange from a discreet distance. The captain nodded his approval, understanding that this was an exceptional situation that warranted flexibility in the usual procedures. After 25 years of flawless service, James had earned the right to a few minutes away from his post for this farewell. As they began walking slowly toward the palace entrance, George maintained a steady stream of conversation, as if trying to pack as many words as possible into their remaining time together. He told James about his plans for the summer holidays, his excitement about starting new subjects at school, and his hopes to visit some of the Commonwealth countries where he might someday serve as king. "When I go to Canada next year with my parents," George said enthusiastically, "I'm going to tell everyone I meet about you. I'll tell them that the guards at our palace aren't just there for show, but that they're real people who care about protecting families and serving their country. Most people don't understand that, do they?" James marveled at the boy's insight into the public perception of his role. Many tourists did indeed see the guards as colorful figures in a pageant, rather than dedicated military professionals. George's understanding that real people with real feelings and commitment stood behind the ceremonial uniforms showed remarkable empathy and awareness of others' experiences. "Your Royal Highness," James said, "when you do visit those countries, remember that the people you meet will judge our entire royal family by how you treat them. Your kindness to me today shows me that you already understand how to make people feel valued and important. That's going to serve you well as you grow into your future responsibilities." They paused at the entrance to the private royal quarters, where their paths would necessarily diverge. James would return to complete his final duties, while George would continue to his scheduled appointment. The physical separation felt symbolic of the transition they were both facing. James toward retirement and civilian life, George toward increasing royal responsibilities and public service. "I wish I could come to your retirement ceremony," George said wistfully. "Father explained that it wouldn't be appropriate because it might overshadow your special day, but I want you to know that I'll be thinking about you and hoping you feel celebrated and appreciated." The thoughtfulness behind this explanation revealed the careful guidance George was receiving from his parents about when royal presence was helpful versus when it might inadvertently shift attention away from the person being honored. Even at 10 years old, he was learning the delicate balance between showing support and allowing others to have their own moments in the spotlight. James knelt down so that he could look directly into George's eyes for their final exchange. "Your Royal Highness, the greatest honor of my entire career has been watching you grow up. You've taught me that protecting someone isn't just about keeping them safe from danger, It's about helping them become the person they're meant to be. You're going to be an extraordinary king someday, and I'll always be proud to have known you when you were young." George's composure finally wavered at these words, and tears began to form in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain royal dignity. "I'll miss you so much," he whispered, temporarily forgetting protocol in the face of genuine emotion. "I'll miss knowing you're there keeping us safe." James felt his own eyes filling with tears, but he smiled warmly at the boy. "I'll miss you too, but I'll never worry about you because I've seen how brave and kind you are. The whole world is lucky to have you as their future king." Mr. Davidson stepped forward with a gentle hand on George's shoulder, providing both physical comfort and a reminder that they needed to continue with their schedule. The tutor's own eyes were moist with emotion, clearly moved by witnessing this profound connection between his young charge and the departing guard. "Come along, Your Royal Highness," Mr. Davidson said softly. "We'll be late for the ambassador, and your mother specifically asked that you make a good impression by being punctual and attentive during the meeting." George nodded and straightened his shoulders, visibly transitioning back into his royal role even as emotion continued to show in his face. He extended his hand formally to James, who shook it with the respect due to a member of the royal family, while simultaneously acknowledging their personal friendship. "Goodbye, Sergeant Mitchell," George said in his most official voice. Then dropping to a whisper that only James could hear, he added, "Goodbye, my friend. Thank you for everything." As George walked away with Mr. Davidson, he turned back twice to wave at James, who remained standing at attention until the prince disappeared from view. The silence that followed felt both peaceful and profound, as if something sacred had just concluded. James stood alone in the corridor for a moment, clutching the wooden box that contained tangible proof of a friendship that had quietly flourished despite every constraint of protocol and position. James returned to his post for the final hours of his career, but the atmosphere around him had completely transformed. Word of Prince George's visit and emotional farewell had spread throughout the palace staff, and a quiet sense of reverence seemed to surround his position. Fellow guards nodded with newfound respect as they passed, and several staff members found excuses to walk by his post, offering subtle gestures of appreciation and farewell. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, approached with a tea service on a silver tray during the afternoon break period. This was highly unusual, as guards on duty typically didn't receive such formal attention, but she insisted that James deserved proper refreshment after such an emotionally significant day. As she set down the cup of perfectly brewed Earl Grey, she whispered, "That young prince has a heart of gold just like his mother. You should feel very proud that he chose to honor you this way." The remaining hours of James's shift passed in a reflective haze. Tourists continued to photograph him and attempt to provoke reactions, unaware that they were witnessing the final performance of a guard whose career had just been validated in the most meaningful way possible. Children pointed and waved. Elderly couples shared stories about previous visits to the palace, and teenagers attempted their usual silly antics, all while James maintained his professional composure despite the emotional turbulence beneath the surface. As evening approached and the time came for the changing of the guard ceremony, James felt a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. This ritual had marked the end of thousands of his shifts over the years, but tonight it would mark the end of his entire military career. Captain Reynolds personally conducted the ceremony, adding special elements to honor James's departure that weren't part of the standard procedure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reynolds announced to the gathered crowd of tourists, "tonight you are witnessing the final duty of Sergeant James Mitchell, who has served with distinction for 25 years as a member of Her Majesty's Guard. His dedication and professionalism have exemplified the highest standards of military service." The tourists responded with spontaneous applause, clearly moved by the significance of the moment, even though they didn't know the full story of the afternoon's events. James stood a little straighter as he heard the appreciation from these strangers, who had come from around the world to witness British tradition in action. During the formal inspection that preceded the guard change, Captain Reynolds paused longer than usual at James's position, checking every detail of his uniform with special care. This wasn't because he expected to find any flaws. James's standards had never wavered throughout his career, but because he wanted to demonstrate the respect and attention that this final inspection deserved. "Sergeant Mitchell," the captain said in a voice loud enough for everyone present to hear, You are relieved of your duty. It has been an honor to serve alongside you." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, acknowledging not just the end of a shift but the conclusion of a distinguished military career. James executed his final salute as a member of the Queen's Guard, a movement so crisp and precise that it drew murmurs of admiration from the watching crowd. He handed over his rifle to his replacement, a young guard who received the weapon with obvious reverence, understanding that he was accepting responsibility from someone who had set an exemplary standard. As James stepped away from his post for the last time, he was surprised to see that a small reception had been organized in the guardhouse. His fellow guards, several palace staff members, and even some off-duty security personnel had gathered to offer their personal farewells. The informal gathering was highly unusual, but the extraordinary circumstances of the day seemed to have inspired everyone to bend the usual protocols. Captain Reynolds presented James with his official discharge papers and a formal letter of commendation that would become part of his permanent military record. But more meaningful than these official documents were the heartfelt words shared by his colleagues, men who rarely expressed emotion, but who clearly felt the significance of losing such a respected member of their brotherhood. "You set the standard for all of us," said Corporal Williams, a guard who had served alongside James for 8 years. "Watching how you carried yourself, how you never complained or took shortcuts taught me what it really means to serve. I'm going to miss having that example to follow every day." Similar sentiments were echoed by guards of all ranks and levels of experience. The newer members spoke about how James's mentorship had shaped their understanding of their role, while the veterans shared memories of challenging situations where his steadiness and experience had been invaluable. Even the administrative staff shared stories about his helpfulness and courtesy during routine interactions that others might have overlooked. As the informal reception continued, James found himself thinking repeatedly about Prince George and their remarkable afternoon together. The boy's visit had transformed what might have been a routine farewell into something extraordinary and memorable. The wooden box remained carefully tucked under his arm, its weight serving as a constant reminder of the unexpected friendship that had developed over the years. Chef Morrison appeared with a specially prepared cake decorated with the regimental insignia and "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell," written in elegant script. "It's not every day we lose someone who's been part of the palace family for so long," he explained as he presented the cake. Seemed like the occasion called for something special. The gesture touched James deeply, representing as it did the recognition and appreciation of people who worked behind the scenes to maintain the daily operations of the palace. These individuals had observed his dedication from a different perspective, seeing him during quiet moments between public duties when his character was most clearly revealed. As the evening wound down and his colleagues began to disperse to their various duties and homes, James took one final walk through the palace corridors he had patrolled for so many years. Every door, every painting, every piece of furniture held memories of his service. He paused at a window overlooking the courtyard where he had spent countless hours standing guard, watching the seasons change and the years pass. The weight of transition settled over him as he realized that tomorrow he would wake up as a civilian for the first time in over 2 decades. There would be no uniform to press, no equipment to clean, no post to report to. The structure that had defined his adult life was about to disappear, replaced by the freedom and uncertainty of retirement. 3 months later, James stood in his cottage garden, carefully tending to the roses he had planted along the front fence. The peaceful routine of retirement had settled around him like a comfortable coat, filled with simple pleasures he had forgotten existed during his years of military service. His days now revolved around gardening, reading, long walks through the countryside, and correspondence with old friends from his regiment. The cottage itself was exactly what he had dreamed of during those long hours standing guard at the palace. Small but comfortable, with exposed wooden beams and a fireplace that crackled cheerfully during cool evenings. The garden had become his special pride, transformed from an overgrown tangle into organized beds of vegetables, herbs, and flowers that changed with the seasons. On his kitchen table, in a place of honor, sat the wooden box that Prince George had given him on that final day. James opened it frequently, not because he feared forgetting the contents, but because the photographs inside never failed to bring a smile to his face and warmth to his heart. Each image captured not just a moment in time, but a reminder of the purpose and meaning that had filled his years of service. He had also begun writing letters to some of his former colleagues who were still serving, sharing stories about his new life and encouraging them to think about their own eventual transitions to civilian life. The adjustment had been easier than he had expected, partly because he had entered retirement with such a strong sense of completion and fulfillment, rather than regret or bitterness. On this particular morning, as James was deadheading the roses and enjoying the early autumn sunshine, he was surprised to hear a car coming up the lane to his cottage. Visitors were rare in this quiet corner of the countryside, and he wasn't expecting anyone. As the vehicle came into view, he was astonished to recognize the distinctive markings of an official royal car, complete with security escort. His heart began racing as the car stopped in front of his cottage and familiar figures emerged. Prince George, now noticeably taller than he had been 3 months earlier, stepped out followed by his mother, Princess Catherine, and Mr. Davidson. The surprise was so complete that James stood frozen among his roses, soil-stained gardening gloves in hand, trying to process what was happening. "Sergeant Mitchell," George called out cheerfully, his voice carrying the same enthusiasm that James remembered from their palace encounters. "We were visiting the village nearby, and Mummy said we should stop to see how you're enjoying retirement. I hope that's all right?" James quickly removed his gardening gloves and approached the royal visitors, still somewhat stunned by their unexpected appearance. "Your Royal Highnesses, this is such an honor. Please, you're more than welcome. I'm just surprised that you found me way out here." Princess Catherine smiled warmly as she took in the sight of the cottage and its beautifully maintained garden. "Prince George has talked about you often since your retirement, and when we learned we'd be in the area today, he insisted that we make time to visit. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but he was quite determined to see how you were settling into your new life." The genuine warmth in her voice and the obvious care behind the visit moved James deeply. The fact that the royal family had taken time from their busy schedule to check on his well-being demonstrated a level of personal concern that went far beyond what he had ever expected or felt entitled to receive. George was already exploring the garden with obvious fascination, examining the vegetable beds and asking questions about the different plants. "Did you grow all of this yourself? How did you know what to plant where? Is it hard to remember to water everything?" His curiosity and enthusiasm reminded James powerfully of their first interactions at the palace, when the boy had shown such genuine interest in everything around him. "Would you like me to show you around the garden?" James offered, falling naturally into the role of teacher that George's questions seemed to inspire. "I've learned quite a bit about gardening since I moved here, though I'm still very much a beginner compared to the experts at the palace." As they walked through the different areas of the garden, George peppered James with questions about retirement life, clearly trying to understand what this new chapter looked like for someone he cared about. James found himself sharing details about his daily routines, his plans for expanding the garden next year, and his contentment with the peaceful pace of country living. "Are you happy?" George asked with the direct honesty that children bring to important questions. "Do you miss being a guard, or do you like this better?" James considered the question carefully, wanting to give George an answer that was both honest and helpful for a boy who was already thinking about concepts of duty, service, and personal satisfaction. "I'm very happy," he said finally. "I loved being a guard and I'm proud of the service I gave, but I'm also enjoying this different kind of life. The important thing is that I know I did my job well for as long as I was needed, and now I can rest and enjoy the results of all those years of hard work." Princess Catherine had been quietly observing the interaction between James and her son, clearly pleased by the obvious affection and respect that flowed between them. "George has been telling everyone about the friendship you developed during your years at the palace," she said. "It's meant a great deal to him to know that someone he admired was paying attention to his visits and valued his company." The conversation that followed revealed how much thought the royal family had given to James's influence on George's development. Princess Catherine spoke about how George often referenced lessons he had learned by watching James maintain his discipline and dedication, using the guard's example to motivate himself through challenging moments in his own education and royal training. "Just last week," she shared, "George had to stand through a very long ceremony honoring veterans, and when I could see him getting restless, He whispered to me that he was thinking about how Sergeant Mitchell could stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what was happening around him. It helped him remember that being respectful sometimes means being uncomfortable, and that's perfectly all right. James felt a profound sense of satisfaction, hearing that his example continued to influence George, even after their physical separation. The idea that years of professional dedication were still bearing fruit in the character development of this remarkable young boy gave retroactive meaning to every challenging moment of his service. As their visit continued, George presented James with a new photograph, this one showing the entire royal family gathered in the palace garden where James had once stood guard. "I wanted you to have this so you could see that we're all doing well," George explained, "and so you'd remember that you helped keep us safe while this picture was being taken, even though you're not in it." The thoughtfulness behind this gift, and George's understanding that James would want reassurance about the continued well-being of the family he had protected, demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity. The boy had somehow grasped that people who serve others often worry about those they've left behind, and he wanted to provide comfort and connection. As the royal visit drew to a close, James felt overwhelmed with gratitude for this unexpected blessing. The fact that Prince George had specifically requested this visit, that Princess Catherine had supported and facilitated it, and that they had all taken genuine interest in his new life, provided closure and validation that he couldn't have imagined when he first hung up his uniform. "Thank you for showing us your beautiful garden and your lovely home," Princess Catherine said as they prepared to leave. "It's clear that you're thriving in retirement, and that brings us great joy. You served our family with such dedication, and seeing you content and peaceful feels like the perfect ending to your years of service." George lingered for a final moment, clearly reluctant to end this special visit. "I'll keep practicing being as steady and reliable as you taught me to be," he promised. "And someday, when I'm king, I'll remember that the most important thing isn't being seen or getting credit, but just doing what needs to be done every single day." As the royal car disappeared down the lane, James stood among his roses with tears of joy streaming down his face, his heart full to bursting with the knowledge that his years of silent service had created bonds of affection and respect that would last a lifetime. The unexpected visit had been Prince George's final gift to him, a demonstration that some friendships transcend every barrier of protocol, position, and circumstance to touch the very best parts of the human spirit.